Everyone, this is Nintendo 3DS.
The Nintendo 3DS, the sequel to the Nintendo DS. So badass, it skipped a whole number. It was the start of two things. The start of the generation that would follow up Nintendo's big boom from the generation prior, the 7th generation of consoles, and the start of Nintendo's bad naming conventions. I got my Nintendo 3DS during the summer of 2013, a time within the gaming landscape that felt like it was past the boom of impact from this console's release, but not past what could be its peak. Throughout my teenage years, I've spent probably upwards more than 1,000 hours on this thing, thanks to its compelling system software and its game library. That is up until around mid-2020, where I made a dumb mistake of selling my 3DS and a few games. The A button was becoming more worn out and less responsive as time went out, and I felt like I'd outgrown the little handheld, thanks to the introduction of an obscure little device called the Nintendo Switch. Knowing I'd eventually want somebody to access my old games, I began searching for a replacement. Throughout the system's lifespan, there have been many hardware versions that have come out, and rather than going after the same system again, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to try out one of the other systems I've missed out on. Well, 2 years later, my life savings gone, I found it, and I'd like to share my findings with you so that should you find yourself in a similar situation, maybe this guide could be of use and save you time and money. I won't be presenting in-depth reviews of these systems, rather my impressions and thoughts on each of them, and rather than going by linear order of release date, I'll be covering them in order of acquisition. So to start things off, the Nintendo 2DS. After the launch of the Wii U, this console further indicated that the naming department at Nintendo was smoking some whack shit. The 2DS came out after the 3DS. While conceptually it makes sense, and there aren't really any better alternative names to communicate with these devices, I'm still gonna poke fun at this. Rip in peace, Wii U. Dubbed by many as the slice of bread, the 2DS sticks out from every other member of the DS family due to its flat design, unlike every other system which sports a clamshell design. The box advertises the best of two worlds. Wow, two worlds. Like 2DS. Best is squared. Whoa. The whole gimmick of the 3D is missing here, which makes it impossible for it to be the best. However, this screen technically has the best resolution out of all the consoles, since it doesn't have to split the resolution for the 3D. Thanks to this simple design, the console is sturdier than its brothers, and it's much cheaper, making it for a very enticing way to get into the 3DS's library. At first touch, it feels very nice. All the buttons are easily accessible, and you can clearly see the screen, straight up to your face. After a minute or two, however, it just gets hard for my hands to get really settled and comfortable with this device. It's just too long for your hands to wrap around it comfortably, with my playstyle options being to either leave my palms hanging by the sides with my fingers wrapped around the top, or my palms holding it by the base and my fingers stretching out to the shoulder buttons. It's not completely unbearable, but the lack of definition leaves it feeling flat and awkward to use for long play sessions. In regards to everything else about the console, it's got a stylus more akin to the one on the DS Lite, doing away with the retractable one the 3DS had, and despite it not being able to display 3D visuals, it still has the same amount of cameras as the 3DS, making your pictures compatible between the systems. It has a slider to put the system to sleep mode. The mono speaker makes for a very lacking hearing experience, and the viewing angle of the screens feels awkward, but I may just be used to playing with the top screen at a slight angle. Worst of all though, its design doesn't lend itself well to portability. The new Nintendo 2DS XL. The first thing that popped me was big. This thing was friggin' huge! The new 2DS XL was a portal to seeing the 3DS software through a lens I never once got a chance at seeing. That being big. Seriously, having only used the standard editions of these consoles for more than a decade, I cannot stress enough how much the size difference struck me by surprise. It being of the lineup of the new 3DS consoles, it has a lot more things to put on the box. The power of two. It's got the power of two, folks! Twice the size, twice the fun, and only twice the dimensions! It offers the extra shoulder buttons, a C-stick, a faster processor, and NFC support. Thing is, I can't seem to get into a groove with this system. It takes after its older brother, the 2DS, but takes it to the extreme lengths of measurements. Not in regards to the ergonomics, this one deserves bongo points for that. It feels very comfortable, but it's everything else surrounding it that detracts from the experience. This console feels very cheap, not to the point where it feels fragile, just really flimsy. For example, the top screen. It has a noticeable wobble. Not enough to ruin the experience, but it can be distracting. The clean smartphone looking top screen is something that is nearly always brought up when discussing this console, which is neat, I guess, but the trade-off is that everything is crammed into the bottom piece of the console. Most notably, the speakers. They're located in the most god-awful spot, in the area where your palms would be resting. Unlike the 2DS, which uses its own screen, the new 2DS XL just uses the same panels as the new 3DS XL, but without the 3D effect, so it gains no resolution advantage. The flap that covers the game card slot is also pretty annoying. Not that you'd really ever use them, but the camera's placement makes them awkward to use. Worst of all, the stylus. My god, this thing is terrible. The new Nintendo 3DS. It seemed like after going 2D twice in a row, it was time to go back to the basics with the new 3DS, resembling more of what I had originally from the get-go, the fancy display and a small package. It's got a lot more of a sturdy feel to it, and the hinge has a noticeable click to it. It also has the C-stick, the extra shoulder buttons, improved specs, NFC support, and face tracking 3D, which despite the 3D tech being much more impressive this time, I guess it doesn't make for as much of a selling point the second time around. Sweet! All that in a compact package. This must be the definitive version. Well, no. The new 3DS has the problem of being impossible to get into that comfortable sweet spot, and that stems from its width. If I want to have my main point of grippage to be with my palms at the base of the console, my index fingers have to extend themselves in an awkward way to reach around the shoulder buttons, or constantly shift from button to button. If I want my fingers properly rested on the shoulder buttons, my palms have to awkwardly clamp around the side of the base rather than comfortably resting in it. Adding more discomfort to this method is if I want to just hit the primary shoulder buttons, I have to extrude my fingers back, because the alternative is to have to finger palm the buttons. Further adding to the problem, you may have noticed that the new 3DS has two sliders on it, one for the 3D effect, one for the volume. It's possible that the bottom half of the console couldn't fit both the newer parts and the volume controls, so they had to fit that in with a 3D slider on the top screen. So on paper I could see why they did this, but in practice, all of that hardware on the top screen makes the console very top heavy. If I want to play laying down, I've got to resort to my fingers to hold up the screen, and it just turns into an uncomfortable floppy experience. The only remedy to not get cramps from playing for a few minutes is to game hunched over, console down, reducing the strain on my fingers and palms, but that's just not an ideal solution. The stylus is also pretty awful. Not as bad as the one for the new 2DS XL, it's just so thin and flimsy feeling. Cramming so much into such a small package is obviously a compromising experience. I figured a bigger chassis would alleviate this problem, which is where our next subject comes in. The new Nintendo 3DS XL. The first thing I noticed about this is the clean glossy look. While I could see the appeal of the faceplates, they never caught on with me. Secondly, unlike the regular 3DS XL, which has a slight redesign over the standard model, the new 3DS XL is just a bigger but thinner new 3DS. The box doesn't even try to distinguish itself from the smaller version. I doubt they couldn't fit the volume button in the bottom half of the console. It would really suck if the XL had to also be top heavy to maintain visual parity with the regular new 3DS. On the plus side, it isn't as much of a struggle to deal with over here. The stylus is finally good. That is, within the new line of systems. The console grip's okay. It's a little thin for my tastes. The 3D effect is probably the most impressive on this console, thanks to the big screen and the face tracking. There's not much to say about this one. She's fine. So in the end, which console did I end up choosing as a replacement? The Nintendo 3DS. I've gone full circle and bought another original Cosmo Black 3DS. A new dimension in entertainment. An 8th gen handheld classic. This decision has very subjective influence. None of the new consoles have that fondness that the original one does, but not to the point that I disregard an objectively better system over it. See, the new systems, while all offering their improvements, all suffer from severe drawbacks. The 2DS, low cost and sturdy, but feels cheap and uncomfortable. The new 2DS XL, comfortable, but feels cheap and has a compromised design. The new 3DS, small, but feels too cramped. The new 3DS XL, could have been better. Despite some shortcomings to its more advanced brothers, to me, the original 3DS doesn't really lose out any of the advantages of the new 3DS. The only game that I personally gained an advantage in is in Metroid Prime Federation Force. On the original hardware, you get a very gimped control scheme, so the additional controls here are a must. Fortunately, I don't associate that game with my past experiences with the original, so it's not something that I have any problem firing up one of the new consoles for. The old hardware is great. Everything is so tightly well put together, and it just works. It fits in my hands, comfortably, no compromises. It definitely is a product of its time though. The underbaked tech, the glass finish, the whoa, it's new but funky button placement, but that's part of the charm. Looking at it now, I can understand some of its criticisms, but I don't necessarily agree with them. The wireless slider, while redundant now especially thanks to updates allowing you to do it through the software, I think it's a convenient and easy way to save battery and turn off wireless communications, but it is inconvenient that you can't turn it back on if you're playing a DS game. The stylus placement, I've come to grow on it, and the additional microscopic amount of time it takes to get it out and ready is worth the bigger size. No other system has its stylus beat if you ask me. And finally, the size. Yes, it's small, but it's not uncomfortable. It is expertly designed in that your fingers wrap around the bumpers and your palms cusp the base. I've never been taken out of the experience due to discomfort, unlike the new 3DS, which gives me cramps within 10 minutes. The face tracking 3D, while technically more impressive, I find to be less fun to use than on the original. It's hard to put my finger on it, but if I had to think of a reason, on the original, it's no doubt a gimmick, one that you have to work with in order to get it to work properly. But once you've got it, wow. Glory to your eyeballs. I think that's what gives it its primitive charm. It works better as a visual spice. I game for however long, at some point I watch some flair, I turn it up for a minute, wow, then I go back to normal. I never used it for more than 2 minutes at a time. I read online that apparently the 3D effect on the new consoles is less intense compared to the standard versions, thus reducing the risk of headaches. To me that makes sense. Along with the face tracking, it justifies the inclusion of the 3D feature by making it a genuine style of play because you could actually handle playing it for long stretches of time, rather than it being a gimmick that you play with for only a few minutes. It doesn't make sense to want to use less of a feature that you are paying more for with the 3DS, but that minimal presence is what gave it its charm. Something else I think is worth mentioning that's present in all the new console variants, the stylus and cartridge slots being at the base of the console. It's a real drag. I keep feeling like I'm going to accidentally pop the cartridge out while gaming. I understand it on the new 3DS, there's only so much space for everything, but was visual parity so important that this awkward design is presented on the XL consoles? I'm certain that they could have put the cartridge and stylus slots at the top of the XL systems. And whose idea was it to give the new 2DS XL such a flimsy stylus? The wobbly top screens were hard not to notice. Apparently it's done to make the hinges less susceptible to breaking, but I've never had any problems with normal use of my DS Lite or 3DS. To me, it doesn't seem worth the extra durability to have a distractingly wobbly top screen. For the XL variants I can get though, they are bigger and heavier, and to its credit, the one on the 2DS XL isn't so bad. After initially buying the new 3DS, I wasn't fond of the volume button being on the top. Design-wise, I thought it added too much noise to the top, and practically, it contributes to the top heaviness of the console. After some time with the newer iterations, however, I can't deny that the muscle memory for the old console is gone, and the one from the new one took place. Maybe I prefer it, maybe I don't. I don't know. I still don't think it's worth the trade-off of it being top-heavy. The one major disadvantage of the original hardware is that if my house were to burn down, and I were to lose everything except for some arbitrary reason my 3DS, I sure as well will have a hard time finding something else to do other than just playing games. Since support for apps like Netflix and YouTube have been discontinued due to the lackluster power of the 3DS. Luckily for me, that already happened far before the 3DS was outclassed. Better not jinx myself there. Despite all the high praise I gave the original 3DS, thanks to my exposure to all the other systems, I've come to realize that I would really only use this for a trip down memory lane or some purist experience. If I wanted to genuinely hunker down and start a new game, I would use the new 3DS XL. The enhanced specs and capabilities of the console help, but it's primarily because once I got my hands on this one, it's hard to go back to using something so small like the original. Well then, fellow viewer, enough about what I think. What is the takeaway here? Which one of these consoles should you choose? Well, assuming you're not some sort of rose-tinted glasses wearing chump, you want the best system. Well, this isn't as easy as I thought it would be to answer. Originally, I wanted to give you a straight answer. One size fits all, no ifs and buts, unlike every other guide I've seen on YouTube. But after trying to do it myself, I can see why they do it. Unfortunately, I don't know you personally. I don't know what your circumstances are, and I don't know what you desire out of your system. On top of that, I don't think there is a definitive version of the 3DS. While yes, I think the original 3DS is a fantastic system, it objectively can't be deemed the definitive version, since most of its iterations offered objective improvements. So in an attempt to diversify my answers, but also keep it as simple as possible, I've boiled it down to 3 recommendations. For the all-rounder, the new Nintendo 2DS XL takes the cake here, along with a big stylus. While not the definitive version of the console, it's the console that would probably best suit most people. It's big, it has advanced specs, it's light, and it's cheaper than its more premium brothers. The only downside is the omission of the 3D effect, but for most people, it's likely that the novelty of it doesn't warrant the inclusion. If you're on a budget and or you don't really care about the fancy hoogie diggies and just want to experience the games on some sort of legitimate hardware, the obvious answer is the Nintendo 2DS. It's the cheapest option of the 3DS family. It's far from the best, but you get what you pay for. Additionally, if you want to play some games with a friend who doesn't own a 3DS of their own, its low cost and durability makes it for the perfect bitch console. If you're looking for the more premium experience, then this one obviously goes to the biggest and newest, new enough, the new Nintendo 3DS XL. It definitely feels the most premium. The new 3DS could also fit the bill, but unless you absolutely want the small form factor, I could not recommend it over the XL. You may have noticed that I didn't mention the 3DS XL, and that's because I think that unless if you're already a fan of this model, or a console collector, there's little to no reason to get this one over of any of the newer and improved ones, though given that I've collected so many, maybe I should reconsider. The poor thing's in a weird middle spot where it doesn't have novelty being the original, but it also doesn't offer big enough improvements to get it over the other newer ones. With that said, if you're interested in getting to some 3DS action and you happen to stumble upon any of these systems for a reasonable price, 100% go for it. The 3DS is last gen, but that doesn't mean it's outdated, nor is it disqualified from providing you with a good time. Even if you're adjusted to modern gaming, you can still comfortably play these games as long as you understand the limited scope of handheld gaming. The games are still fun, you can still find a lot of them at a reasonable price, and plenty of games still have an active online community on this system. Well, that's all done. I guess I have no use for these anymore. Oh shit. That sucks. But hey, I can kill some time by playing some games or watching some YouTube on my new Nintendo.